Here we are. I
All
was just
right.
Nicole and I are following in your footsteps, both planning some weddings right now.
Oh,
Um,
nice. Yeah, I remember you telling me that when we caught up a few months ago. Did you get the date?
we did. We got some time, but yeah, March 2025.
Good. That's enough time. Although you
Need a
might
lot
want to
more
definitely if
details and planning in my life.
you're not taking the rip the band-aid approach. That's a low and slow burn till
Yeah, easy,
March of
slow
25.
burn. Yeah. All right, looks like we have most of the people trickling in here. Ben, I appreciate you doing this. I'm really excited for this conversation. I think you and myself have some unique experiences that are worth sharing and a lot of battle wounds, so to speak. So I wanted to start with an icebreaker for everyone. So it's almost Thanksgiving. Um, so icebreaker today is, what is your favorite way to eat potatoes? For people that are joining and trickling in, I'd love to see some of these answers in the chat. I also know that 2023 has given us, at least myself, a lot of gray hair. So I won't be surprised to see vodka coming in there. Ben, favorite way to consume potatoes?
So I'm personally I just got a grill like a month ago, and I've been grilling sweet potatoes. So that's probably my answer. And then, as you know, I got married about a month ago, and my wife has been doing the KitchenAid's like a rite of passage when you get married. She's been whipping up mashed potatoes with the KitchenAid, and I've been enjoying eating those. So I cheated and gave two, but
Okay,
we
Walter
got
Roth
loaded.
dipping French fries in a milkshake. Intense. Mine is a Peruvian. My fiance's Peruvian. There's a famous dish there called causa. They tend to put potatoes in everything. If anyone knows Peruvians, 9 out of 10 of them will tell you that they have 4,000 types of potatoes, which is very interesting and they're very proud of. Um, Aside from the potato talk, I'm really interested to see the mix of people we have. There's been a skew of bigger company folks that are looking to go smaller first time AEs or even founders. I'd love some interaction in the chat for people that are sales leaders at an early stage company. I'd love for you to put an A in the chat. For people that are at a bigger company or exploring going early stage, I'd love to see a B so we can just get a sense of the folks. And then I know there's also a bunch of founders, so I'd love to see a C for any founders.
Nice. A lot of A's. A
Okay.
lot of gray hairs in the chat.
Yeah, exactly. All right. And then also, I DM'd a couple people as folks were signing up for this. I think we have an opportunity. Ben's lending us his time today, someone who's really gone through this. I think there's a lot of people on LinkedIn talking about different advice and theory. Ben, like you've seen this, the two companies combined have grown to, 1,200 employees, tons of funding, tons of revenue. I'd love for this to be interactive. So, we plan for about 30 minutes, 25 minutes of content. We'll take a bunch of questions as we go. Taylor from the Champify team will help us make sure we're answering the best questions. So feel free to chime in with questions here. I'll kick us off. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm really excited about this topic today. Founder-led sales to closing 40% of the Fortune 50. I think, Ben, again, you're someone who's done this. For people that don't know me, my name's Todd Bustler. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Champify. We help B2B companies make it really easy to drive high-quality pipeline from their strongest advocates. Before starting Champify, I spent a year as an operator in residence at Unusual Ventures, where I exclusively focused on helping companies go from idea phase to about 1 million in ARR. And then before that, I also was really in the trenches at a product analytics company called Heap. I was the first sales rep, joined at about 200K in ARR, left 6 years later, pushing 40, 45 million in ARR. So Ben, love a quick intro for people that don't know your background.
For sure, yeah. So originally in finance, I was an equity trader in New York for a few years. Got into sales accidentally about a decade ago. First gig was at a company in Boston called Insight Squared. Good place to land if you're a young up-and-coming seller, as you were selling to sales and marketing leaders, sales pipeline and funnel analytics, which was a great education and spawned a lot of phenomenal sales leaders and sales reps in the Boston area. Many of which I've now worked with at 2 or 3 companies. Data Robot was one of my customers. I landed there in 2016. They were just around $1 million in ARR as the first non-enterprise sales hire. So definitely catchy title. I do want to be authentic. Like, we can touch on some of the things I've observed and implemented, especially here at Jellyfish, in terms of getting up off the ground for the enterprise motion. But Data Robot found a lot of success in the enterprise. I managed their global mid-market and commercial sales team, starting as the first seller, and then grew teams in London and Singapore and Boston to about 40 reps over the 4 years there. And then got the itch to go back to something. The company was around between 50 and 100 million in revenue about 4 years later. And I got the itch to go back to the building stage and do it again. And I've been at Jellyfish for about 4 years now. Company was just exiting founder-led sales, probably had 20, 25 customers, mid six figures and ARR. And, we're around 200 plus employees now. Sales team's grown to about 40 or 50 reps, about 25 account executives, 10 BDRs and leadership. And we are selling, across Fortune 50 to, Series A and B startups. So, that's a long-winded background, but probably enough for today's chat.
Yeah, no, awesome background. I agree on the Insight Squared experience to kind of get an MBA and just talking to so many go-to-market leaders and sales folks and see all the different motions. So awesome starting point. Okay, let's dive into it. So, you mentioned Jellyfish being around the 20th employee or so as they were transitioning out of founder-led sales, even at Data Robot, where in the early days, you close a lot of different logos. You're really trying to figure out that ICP. How did you go about figuring that out? Like, how does this start? How do you go from, hey, we've closed a bunch of people, we're figuring out where we're getting some fit. Okay, then now go. What's your process? How do you approach that to nail that ICP?
I mean, I think one thing that I've seen across all three companies the last decade is, we'll talk an ICP. So we'll share the screen in a second. When specifically talking about the ICP, I think that it's important to differentiate. Founders have their vision of what the ICP is. At Insight Squared, it was like to power sales and marketing analytics for all SMB companies. Data Robot was especially challenging because machine learning use cases propagated in almost every industry. And so, especially with those two, I think that the founders are telling a certain story to the market and to investors. And so it's typically pretty broad because you do want to tackle a big TAM. And then I think as an early seller or sales leader, you have to look at where you're actually finding traction, and the narrower you can get on that ICP, the better. So an example was Insight Squared. We had the SMB vision and story, and we were even told that, as employees. And then I look at our CRM, and it's very clearly B2B SaaS companies that are buying this thing. And so as a early even sales rep there, it wasn't SMBs, and I wasn't thinking about, Joe's Landscaping or, an accounting firm, that could be a prospect. It's very quickly just coming from an outsider's perspective that it was B2B companies. Data Robot, let's say 25 customers when I started. Oh, the whole world is our oyster, and it was very exciting. But of the 20 to 25 customers when I was there, again, I looked very closely and distinctly at the use cases in the industry, and like 3 of them were finance companies with this underwriting use case for lending. And all of a sudden, as an early seller trying to get this thing off the ground, it takes what appears to be a very overwhelming, start to just say, okay, I can find 100, 200 lending companies and tell this very specific underwriting use case to them and build on that. And so even when looking at something like, for example, B2B SaaS, if you've got 20 customers, I'd look at their competitors and their markets where they're a recognizable name and build a tree that's just, let's say if you have 20 customers, find their 4 or 5 largest competitors or partners or people that they cite as customers on the website. And all of a sudden you just narrow it to a few hundred names that you can start with to get off the ground, because as a founder, you want to tell a big story and have a big vision for where this is used. And then it juxtaposes what a seller finds most valuable in getting something off the ground is efficiency and being very targeted with your approach. And so, on the ICP topic specifically, I think going narrower and really, if you're coming into a situation where there's a few paying customers, building a bit of like a relationship tree, just even around that handful, or picking a subset of them for a very sliver vertical within something, even as what could be narrow, like a B2B SaaS is a good start.
When was the right time to start narrowing in? Like you start at Jellyfish or even to Data Robot, they have some customers, you're listening to calls, you're joining a bunch of calls. Like, how did you go from, okay, let me learn to like, okay, here, let's narrow in that focus?
I think that, again, it varies from, if you're trying to get your first 10 to if you come in and there's 10 or 20 customers. I think meeting with customers, and I'll talk about some ways to do this when we touch on the slides, but I do think it's important to meet with your early set of customers, and even as a sales leader who didn't sell them, start to ask them questions around why they bought, start to hear in their own words, which their own words may differ from the words that the founders are using or the existing reps are using. And so I think if you have 5 customers to interview out of a subset of 20, like anyone who's considering an early stage sales leader job or coming in at that kind of founder led transition out, super important to talk to customers, because you're going to pick up on snippets or phrases that they're using that is not necessarily top of mind or what you're being told internally. And there's always this kind of juxtaposition between the founder's vision, what they tell the market, what they tell investors, what they tell employees. Some of that's resonating clearly because people are buying and using the product early adopters. But then all of a sudden you interview them and you're hearing in their words what problems they're solving or even phrases that they're using. And if you pick up on some patterns there, you can try and experiment and copy and paste what they're saying to the market, and you may find some lift there.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I want to get to one of your first points here, which is like, okay, you come in. I think that's very true. Founders are telling a big story for investors, visionary, and you're like, okay, look, we need to talk about what we have right now. We need to know who the best people to talk to. How do you approach that? Like, you mentioned it all starts with the meeting. What do you mean by that? How did you approach it?
Yeah, so I put together a few lessons learned here, just looking across the last 3 stops. And I did want people, whoever's tuning in, to walk away with some kind of tactical, either lessons learned or plays to try. This first one is not necessarily, this is probably at the stage where you're ready to hire your first seller or 2, or maybe you're coming in and there's a small sales team that's existing. A common theme that I've felt, and just seen, and it's not rocket science. I don't want to claim rocket science, but in my history, both here in Data Robot, you need conversations to experiment and iterate. Like, it all starts with a volume of conversations, hopefully within your ICP, but you actually may find tangential use cases or tangential personas by just having conversations. So your currency as an early stage company is conversations. So I have a couple points on like things I've seen that have been successful there. But if you don't have conversations with people, you have no ability to iterate and experiment. And everything early stage is on the premise of experimentation. Like, something that you might think coming in is, I have to build systems, I have to build a process. and you might, as a founder, look to hire someone that's very systems and process oriented, but that is way premature if you don't have discovery calls to experiment with. And so that's always been my kind of North Star, is in having conversations. It allows me to try a new pitch. It allows me to try a new pricing model, try a new engagement model, test out phrases or use cases. And that's just super important to always have as a North Star. So in this first one, if you go to the next slide here, just talking about the personas of the people that I've hired. I've always looked for people that early stage can exhibit the skills and have a background in generating an outbound meeting above, let's say, pedigree from their past companies or enterprise, closing experience. I may be biased because both companies within my domain of experience have been top down. While it has been inside sales driven, there tends to be high ACV deals, and neither company in the early days had a freemium type of product or offering. And while that was scary as an early stage sales leader, it also built muscle memory in myself and in the team culture and in the reps we hired, that we had to control our own destiny. And so the first handful of hires at both companies have been very talented people, but people that were extremely resourceful and scrappy in getting meetings. Because as an early stage leader, you're going to be on those meetings with them, alongside them. If you're a founder, you're going to be there. And so, I would very much prioritize and think about, irrespective of if it's a product-led approach, to bring people on or to lean into the fact that you yourself are a BDR as an early stage leader, and you're looking for people that have very strong BDR type of skill sets to help you experiment there as well.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Ben. And sorry for hopping in. Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor at Champify. I lead our marketing team here. Todd's Wi-Fi just completely died, so I will be asking some follow-up questions. And Ben, you're talking about the ability to be a BDR. I guess I'm curious, when you're thinking about hiring that first AE or hiring that, first early profile, or even you yourself as an early sales leader for the founders on the call, how far away should they be? Is it a cultural thing where they have kind of like that pipe gen in their bones, or you looking to hire someone who's kind of fresher off the BDR life?
I think two things. I mean, I put within 5 years. I think the industry is changing so fast that relevancy and recency does tend to have some advantages in terms of what was successful 10 years ago might not be successful now. The other thing is stage fit is super important. Love people that have thrived in early stage or growth stage companies. I often ask about what the enablement program was like or what the processes were like, because you're looking for people that have operated in an unstructured environment and have the ability to be pretty resourceful and independent on their own. I'm not saying hire a BDR as your first sales rep by any means, but someone that has thrived in an unstructured environment where they had to generate their own meetings. Again, I'm just within my own sphere of understanding and experiences, but that has been very helpful in kind of getting the pipeline off the ground, which, as you guys know, is a very high leverage point for these early stage companies.
Some advice that's very similar to this from one of the sales leaders I respect most, which is Dini Mehta, who led Lattice, is always the people who worked and led sales successfully or were hitting their quotas at companies that maybe didn't have product market fit are often really great people to hire for this kind of first role, because they really have to scramble and experiment. They didn't have that instant kind of click, so they have that kind of experimentation. Going into your next kind of takeaway, Ben, you have this great quote here that if you want money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money. Like, would love to know how this fits into that setting up meetings and going into your early sales experimentation.
Yeah, I mean, this just was top of mind for me. You know, this was a founder. She reached out to me, I think, like a week or two ago, and kept it very high level, very direct. I mentioned she used to be a sales leader herself, so I do think that in getting meetings early stage, just being very direct. Also interesting, she went text message versus LinkedIn, but she is farming her network. It's not someone I've talked to in the last few years, but very concrete with the ask 30-minute meeting. And I think that in my experience of doing some outreach myself for early stage, being very, people love to give their opinions, so appealing to them, phrases like, we're coming out of stealth mode. We'd love to get your feedback on what we're building. If you come from that domain, being able to trade notes on why you built what you built. But I think that the phrasing on input and advice here and being very direct around the ask and some of the LinkedIn outreach that I've seen, all you can do, again, it all comes back to conversations. One way to jumpstart conversations is just by looking for people's advice. And in doing so, that'll give you more at bats. And I would caution people when getting those meetings to jumping into pitch mode right away versus keeping it conversational and a little bit more two-sided. It would be some advice here.
And when you're doing,
but yeah, she booked the meeting, so she's
right, so it works.
doing something right. Yeah.
And I guess, like, going into that, you're leading with a conversation. As you go through more and more conversations, and maybe this fits in a little bit here, but how are you thinking about how those conversations actually translate into the sales motion you want to build? Or how are you using, these conversations to help influence that kind of like circular loop as you think about your hypothesis that you're going for when you're building out that ICP and where you guys should be focusing your efforts?
Yeah, so I included this. This is proudly my first meeting booked at Jellyfish. I started mid-March 2020. This was to a CTO at a fellow portfolio company. And there's a few things here. One is I would, for those folks who are leading sales or founding companies and have received their first round or second round of funding, I've always loved to look at fellow sister companies with investors. It's always been, when you think about triggers, it's a very powerful trigger. You can see in my first connection request there, we're also backed by Excel. That has been something that, many of the teams that I've led have utilized. And then I think from this first principles concept, again, it kind of goes into just, as a sales leader, you need to deeply understand not just, high level what your product is, but in talking with those customers, like I mentioned, and talking with the founders on the problems that they built the product to solve, I included this just PDF that helped generate this meeting, which was very simple. It's just, what are the questions that this product helps you answer? So for Champify, it might be something along the lines of, where have my past buyers gone to? That's probably something that's top of mind for marketing and sales leaders. But in phrasing it in an approachable way in terms of the questions that you are helping answer, that's also distilling the product and the value proposition down for your audience into, there's no features here, right? You mentioned, or if you're looking at that PDF, that one of these questions caught this gentleman's eye, and there was nothing really feature related to those questions. So I think it's a good experiment for founders and early stage sales leaders, or if you're interviewing with a prospective company, it's a good thing to ask the founders and start to understand yourself and see if that can resonate with you in a way that you feel is compelling or differentiated.
Yeah, I love this. I have a couple of questions for you on that, but real quick, just want to distill some of kind of like how Ben talks about approaching it and how we've been approaching it at Chamify. Really, those first principles, like going with an experimental and focus-based approach, is we actually have this little template that we use, to help focus our early sales as we're growing, where every month we're starting with a hypothesis. We have an owner for the hypothesis. They're using some of Ben's tactics, really conversational selling, or kind of leading with, hey, like, are you trying to do this? And trying to get that conversation started with things that, our buyers might be concerned about. So what it actually looks like is we're sending, target meetings, and then we're looking at the results. So we'll have the hypothesis, have the audience, use those more conversational techniques, and see which actually has the best results in meetings. That way we can test audience, that way we can test messaging, so that we can really iterate, because, at the beginning you're doing a bunch of things that like don't scale, but the whole goal is to really find the scale. So for everyone on this call, I'll drop the template in the chat in case that might be valuable. But Ben, I actually want to switch gears and you've done all this work to land your first meetings. I'm really curious, like, what does it look like to take this early founding kind of experimental approach and transform that into, a top-down sales motion? How are you thinking about building your systems? When do you even think about moving from experimentation to scale?
I think it varies. I have personally stayed very close to the sales cycles early on at both companies. Again, I really, building for scale is a luxury. It's not a necessity. You only have the right to worry about repeatability and scalability when you are at a stage that is typically much later than people expect. And again, it's not to say that it's not important. Certainly starts to matter, 10, 20 million ARR plus, but under even just 10 million ARR as a threshold is something where, markets are changing so fast. The macro is changing so fast. By the time you build something with, you want to be close to product, understand what they're building, have them listening in on these conversations early. But, just speaking from my experience, again, it's only limited to what I know, but I've stayed very close through, 10 million plus, and you're talking about at that point, multiple teams where you can't be on every conversation, and some baselining, needs to happen. But that's my experience. There's no, magic formula.
I feel like we're all looking for that silver bullet, and the reality is it's just a lot of hard work continuously to really build something.
Yeah, we call it hand-to-hand combat. Like just every deal feels somehow unique, and you'd be surprised how far that gets you. It's obviously important, but it's iteration and experimentation, and being able to iterate quickly is a superpower. That's why, as an early stage startup, there's a lot of advantages to being able to do that without a whole committee and a quarterly, KPI. Like, there's advantages. You should take advantage of that environment. When, I've always thought about it as survival. Like, survival at bats, survival is number one. And so you have more time than you think to build the infrastructure around that engine. But you can't do that if you're too distant from the customer.
I love that. I feel like one of our mantras, here at Chamify the biggest advantage to being lean is being able to move fast and make decisions fast and keep that iterative approach. You mentioned a bunch of things that I think are pretty new, but we're having a bunch of conversations with leaders like Brian Hennig at ThoughtSpot, with you, where you're talking about being the one who's like actually in the hand-to-hand combat. You're the one who's actually setting meetings for your team. How do you think the role of leadership has changed? I'm not sure, like when I first started out, that's something that I heard or saw from leaders in sales.
I, you know, I had to do the job at Data Robot. There was no team to manage, the first month. And it was important to me that, and I know that there's many different ways of thinking about leadership and scaling companies. The only way that I found I was able to grow the team and grow that business was to be individually successful before I could think about teaching others to do it. So kind of leading from the front has always been important to me, both from a work ethic perspective, from a product perspective and product knowledge perspective, domain perspective. That's always been kind of central. And I think in doing that, you start to have this magic of osmosis where you're in the lab with your reps as a peer, and you're learning and experimenting alongside them. And I think coming to Jellyfish, there was a small team that was, I think there was 3 AEs and a BDR or 2 when I came here. And the only thing I knew was to kind of repeat that process. And I wanted to be, empathetic and understand what they had been doing for the 6 or so months prior to me coming. But I also didn't want that to sway, again, that kind of first principles mindset of trying to understand it for myself. And so, yeah, it's really just been a servant leader, I think, mentality. And I think more specific to your question on how leadership is changing, I think it's one of the things that, I think is more important than ever for sales leaders right now is financial literacy. And what I mean by that is, finance is so involved in every SaaS decision-making process that you have to be both aware of the macro conditions, what impact interest rate is having on the funding environment, because that may change the type of companies that you're, targeting as an early stage employee. If all of a sudden, you're selling to early stage companies and you're seeing the market shift in funding there, they're translating into survival mode. So I think having a strong macro understanding and background, just even as simple as like, staying in touch with whether it's the Wall Street Journal or certain financial news, I think staying up to date, you can no longer kind of remain in your SaaS sales silo. You have to branch out and be in touch with the macro. And then you also, in enabling your team, the job of sales and software has really shifted to buyer enablement, specifically as it relates to the financial conversations that they're having. And, when we look at our win rates, for example, this single contact, we looked in Gong, I don't know them off the top of my head, but, single contact win rate was like, let's say 15% or 13%. Even just 2 years ago, it's down to like 7% now, which means like you can't rely on one person just shouldering the load here. You have to enable a team of people to articulate specifically to financial leadership function, why they're making the decision that they're making. And in an environment where there's just no budget to go around, it's always kind of zero based, or what are you going to replace this with? If you can't articulate that very clearly, you can't expect your reps to articulate it. And if your reps can't articulate it clearly, then there's no way you can expect your buyers to. And so both at Data Robot and Jellyfish, very early on, we developed frameworks around business cases and buyer enablement from an ROI perspective that was very helpful in justifying the investment, and just now more than ever that this is just super important. So I think every sales leader just needs to take financial literacy seriously, not just for themselves, but for their teams, going forward. And that's been a big enablement push we've had, where we've got BDRs trained to read 10Ks, and, we're utilizing ChatGPT to summarize earnings transcripts so that they can spit that back to a CFO. Like, that's the level that we're playing on now, because that's what you have to do to break through the noise and to, interact with these executives in this day and age.
Yeah, we're hearing more and more, like, the number of people involved in the scrutiny on even like a 20K deal these days is just, basically what used to be the scrutiny for, a 6-7 figure deal. So yeah. I love this point. In addition to, and this is gonna be the last question, so if anyone else listening in has questions, please pop them in the chat and I'll read them out to Ben here. But in addition to, really focusing on enabling your team with financial literacy, looking forward to 2024, is there anything else that you're thinking you really do want to change, or anything that you want your teams to stop doing going into this next year?
I think the thing that comes to mind, it's not something, it's a big push we made this year. I think next year it's about following through, and it's, we're a top-down sale. We're interacting with executives, doing your homework before these calls. Like I talk about at bats, if you are a seller or a sales leader and you're waltzing into a discovery call with a VP or C-level person, and you haven't done the time to look up, have they posted anything on LinkedIn? Has that company been in the news? Should you be aware of layoffs or acquisitions or certain investment decisions that were made? What was their last earnings report like? You're completely leaving, a lot on the table. And so we've made a big push this year and just showing up with a hypothesis, doing our homework to make a difference in that buyer's experience, mentioning posts that they've made. We have reps listening to podcasts that they've been on so that they can cite them. Just the buyer experience of that first call, and then repeating that back. Here's what we heard in the second call. Discovery calls, again, just going back to currency, like that is a very finite currency. That our team and what we're striving for is that's an amazing experience for the buyer. And there's a lot that you can be doing before that call, that just making sure that is adopted, that it's consistently used across the team is something that, I think is important for us. And I think that'll have an effect on early stage conversion rate, especially getting that second and third meeting.
Yeah, it's so hard to get the first meeting sometimes. It's important to come with all your.
I tell people, you'll spend 3 months chasing this account. Someone finally responds. You probably put in countless hours. Why wouldn't you put in an hour of research or half hour of research before that shows up to just make it that much better of an experience? And they're finally there. But yeah, right. Yeah. Do we have time for questions?
We have a couple minutes left for questions. Anyone in the audience have anything for Ben while we're here? I know you just shared a bunch of tactical advice. I know a lot of times webinars can be super high level, so really appreciate you keeping it grounded. In case there aren't questions, we'll be kind of summarizing all of these key takeaways that Ben shared and sending them out to you guys via email in the next couple weeks. We got a couple people thanking us. There's a survey if you want to drop us a note on what we could do better to make this useful for you. Ashish says, what piece of advice do you have for your founder, who is also the only person who has been the sales leader thus far? Great question.
2, one is asking more open-ended questions. I think discovery is a skill that doesn't come easy to anyone, especially because if you've built something that you're really proud of, you're going to want to show it off. So I think practicing questioning, and I've seen certain reps, they talk about a question funnel. Well, they'll write down second and third level questions. So Ashish, an example might be, asking a certain question. And if someone asks you, can you do this feature, instead of, for example, jumping in because you're excited that your product can do that feature, maybe asking them like an open-ended question, like, why did you ask that? Or what are you doing today around that? So I think improving your questioning, even going as far as writing down questions that you want to ask, and practicing second and third level questions of when you hear a response, don't just move on. I think you'll find that your conversations will be a lot more two-way, and that'll give you more surface area to, I believe, like start to wedge your product in a way that's probably more relevant for that person.
Awesome. Will asks, what is your approach to handling the "we don't have bandwidth to take this on right now" objection?
Yeah, I think that what that really tends, so there's two things. What that tends to mean to me is that you're not aligned to that person's top 2 or 3 things. And there's always something that's going to be important enough to make bandwidth for. It just means that your solution is not tied to one of those, let's say 2 or 3 things. So like right now for me, territory planning and segmentation for next year is very top of mind for me. A lot of my time is going into that planning process. So if you're selling me something that's not tied to that, I might be honest with you, just might not have the bandwidth for it. At Jellyfish, we have the luxury of being able to tie our solution to a lot of different initiatives, and a better reporting solution might not be what stands out. So what's important for us to do is ask our buyer, what is your top 2 or 3 strategic initiatives for next year, and see if there's a way that your product can be tied to those. And if not, you don't have to force the issue. Close loss, revival, and nurturing that lead is really important, because you will be top of mind at some point. But I would either find someone higher in the account if you feel like that it should be a priority for them, or putting it back on them and just asking them where their bandwidth is tied to, that's important for them next year.
Awesome. We have about 30 seconds before this ends, and there's like a ton of really great questions here that I don't actually think we have time to answer. So what I will do, I see all these questions from Isaac, from Chris, from, let's see, Rachel about plans. We'll sit with Ben. We'll get some answers on. We'll make sure to send them in our follow-up email for you guys.
Can add me on LinkedIn too. I'm not like a crazy thought leader there. I like the live is easier probably for me, but happy to build out the network. And if I can answer any questions directly, happy to. But yeah, appreciate the insight and engagement from folks, and hopefully this was helpful for people. And thank you, Taylor, for setting this up.
Yeah, thank you so much, and have a good one.
Thanks.